Let's talk about some practical skills for how to find great restaurants when you're in Europe. There's a few things that you want to look for, and I would say it is really worth going to a little effort to find a good restaurant. I see every meal in Europe as an opportunity to have a great dining experience. Now that's a really high bar, and sometimes I'm willing to lower my bar and settle for just some basic food because I need a functional meal on the go. But I sort of consider it a fun scavenger hunt. Every meal should have a memory attached to it. And you know what? It doesn't take a lot of effort to make sure that you find a great, memorable restaurant like this one. If you don't put any effort into it, you'll wind up at a place it's just okay. Here are a few tips I would have for finding great restaurants in Europe. One of them is get away from the main tourist zones, especially the restaurant row. A lot of popular cities in Europe have one street where all of the restaurants are located. In Brussels, they have the Rue du Boucher, which is lined with lots of interchangeable restaurants, and there's a salesperson out front each one trying to get you in to have a table. Every place serves identical buckets of mussels and beer and so forth. If you walk just a few steps off the main drag, you're going to find something a little more interesting. In Dubrovnik, in Croatia, a city I go to a lot, they have a restaurant row that's very similar to the one in Brussels. People waiting out front trying to lure you in with flashy menus. In Croatia, in Dubrovnik, you can walk along this restaurant row on the right, or you can climb the staircase on the left, and literally less than a 5-minute walk away, you can find a beautiful, secluded little corner restaurant or cafe with half the prices, twice as good food, much friendlier people. This sounds almost so obvious it isn't worth saying, but it really strikes me after spending years and years looking for good restaurants for our guidebooks. It's so easy to find a good restaurant that's very close to a very bad restaurant. One of my tips for finding good restaurants, in addition to just going off to the little back corners, figure out what the trendy neighborhood is in that city. So in the city of Athens, for example, all the tourists are concentrated in the neighborhood called the Plaka. This is the kind of old town of Athens at the base of the Acropolis. And there are some good restaurants in the Plaka, but they tend to be very expensive and quite touristy. Literally across the street from the Plaka, a 5-minute walk away, is a neighborhood called Psidi. Now Psidi was kind of a rundown, deserted slum as recently as 10 or 15 years ago. But now Psidi is coming back to life. The government has undertaken policies to make it very attractive for hotels and restaurants to open up there. Psidi is the neighborhood in Athens where all of the young Athenians go to eat. So if you go to Psidi, you're going to find a really interesting array, more creative array of choices than in the Plaka. Often much cheaper, better quality food, friendlier surface, and it'll feel like a more local experience. Every city in Europe has a trendy, foodie, hipster neighborhood, and I make it a challenge when I'm going to a new city. I'm going to look around a little bit and figure out what that neighborhood is, because I think that's where I'm going to find some good restaurants. Another tip for finding a good restaurant, generally, a good sign is if a place is small, kind of family-run mom-and-pop restaurants. We love mom-and-pop restaurants in our guidebooks. They often are pretty traditional, but they offer great quality. They offer a real loving care and interest in the food that they're cooking. This is one of our favorite restaurants in Croatia. We take our Croatia tours here, in fact. Alma does all of the cooking over an open fire, and her husband, Anton, does the front of house management and sort of waits tables. They have a bare bones staff. It's really just the two of them and a couple of helpers. That keeps their costs low, which means that my costs are low, and it means that the people making the food have been doing this for years and they really care about it. They have a passion for it. They're not just somebody who's got a minimum wage job that they're coming and going from. Another thing to look for that's a mark of a good restaurant is a menu that is short, handwritten, and in one language. Now, why is that important? Short, handwritten, in one language. It's short because the restaurateur wants to do a few things and do them very well. I am very suspicious of a very long menu. If a menu is more than 2 pages long, I assume it's a terrible restaurant. Now that seems harsh, but think about it. How many frozen ingredients do you have to have a 10-page long menu? Short is a virtue. Handwritten because it's based on what is in season. It's based on what's fresh. It's based on what they found in the market today. And it's in one language because it's catering to local people. It's not catering to one-time tourists who are just passing through. It's catering to people who they want to develop into a return clientele. Those are the three magic features of a great restaurant, a menu that is short, handwritten, and in one language. Now, all of that said, I really prioritize the quality of the food and the quality of the experience in my restaurant hunting, but I am at times willing to compromise to have a beautiful setting. So don't rule that out. If you want the best food all the time, sometimes you're going to have to settle for places that are a little less memorable. If you're really interested in a great experience and a beautiful setting, it can be worth paying a little too much. This is the city of Dubrovnik in Croatia. I spend a lot of time there, and every morning for breakfast, you're going to find me at these tables right here on the main drag, where they have decent coffee and mediocre ham and eggs. I'm not here for the food, but this is my favorite place to start my day in Dubrovnik, and I'm willing to sacrifice on quality and pay a bit more because I get to watch the city waking up. I get to see the delivery people coming through on their little carts before all the tourists arrive. You see the first of the cruise ship passengers walking in at the gate at the far end of town. I'm willing to trade a little bit on quality and price if I can have a memorable setting and a memorable location. Here's a good tip for that, by the way. You don't necessarily have to have your whole meal. It's a big investment maybe to have your whole meal in a place with a beautiful setting. So I think a good strategy is to have drinks, overpriced drinks, but really memorable drinks before or after dinner in a really beautiful setting, and then you can find something a little less, more affordable, a little less touristy maybe, for your actual meal. In Prague, for example, there's a beautiful hotel right on the main square, and it has this gorgeous terrace with views overlooking the old town square. In Florence, there's a hotel that I really like that has a top floor cafe, and you can go here right after work, and for about 18 euros, you can buy a cocktail. That's a lot for a cocktail, but it's a cocktail with this gorgeous view looking out over the Ponte Vecchio and the hills of Florence and the Arno River. And by the way, that cocktail comes with a little mini buffet of snacks. So if you're discreet about it, you can almost assemble a light dinner and a cocktail and beautiful views for 18 euros. Like I said, you don't have to be spending a lot of money to be a foodie. There are ways to get around that. And these days, rooftop bars are popular all over Europe. Budapest, for example, one of my favorite cities in Hungary, has a gorgeous rooftop bar culture with great views, and it's where all the young urbanites go to hang out after work before they go find an affordable dinner somewhere. I want to emphasize, if you really want to get great restaurants, it's really worth doing your homework. There are lots of pubs in Britain that serve pretty forgettable pub grub, but you know what? If you do a little bit of homework and you think carefully about it, and do some research, you're going to find a gastropub. This is a pub that serves a little bit higher quality food. It puts more emphasis on its food and less emphasis on its beer maybe, or equal measures. Do your homework and you're going to find a better meal. How do you do your homework? Well, obviously as a guidebook author, I think guidebooks are a great place to start. And I spend a lot of my time working on our Rick Steves guidebook, specifically looking for great restaurants that fit all of these descriptions that I've just been laying out for you here. That said, different people have different philosophies about food. I think the key thing isn't to use the Rick Steves guidebook, it's to find a guidebook that matches your culinary philosophy, that seems to have the kind of restaurants that you like to go to. And once you find that, it can be a great tool for finding the right restaurants for your trip. You know, crowdsourcing sites are very popular these days. TripAdvisor is very powerful in terms of the world of tourism. I don't want to necessarily throw TripAdvisor under the bus, but I have a lot of skepticism about these crowdsourced sites. I use them for hotels. I think they can be very helpful for that, maybe for sightseeing experiences or tours. For restaurants, maybe not so much. Let me give you some examples of why I'm a little bit skeptical about TripAdvisor for restaurant hunting. Budapest, Hungary, I just mentioned, is one of my favorite cities anywhere, and I think Hungarian cuisine is fantastic. Actually, I think after French and Italian, personally, I think Hungarian is the next best cuisine in Europe. I think it's tragically underrated. And I know for a fact that there are lots of fantastic restaurants in Budapest. The number one rated restaurant in Budapest on TripAdvisor is a French restaurant, not a Hungarian restaurant. And the reason for that is simply that the people who are leaving reviews on TripAdvisor are tourists, so their interests and their preferences skew to a touristy end of the spectrum. Let me give you an example from the city I live in, Seattle. I love going out to restaurants here in Seattle. And recently I was just curious, try this in your hometown. I was curious, so I went to TripAdvisor and I said, what are the top 10 restaurants in Seattle? And I looked at this list and I said, you know, I can't remember the last time I went to any of these. And you know what else they have in common? The top 5 restaurants are all right at Pike Place Market, right? The most touristy part of Seattle. And all 10 of them are within about a mile of downtown. They're within about a mile of where the cruise ships come in. I'm not saying don't use crowdsourcing sites. I'm saying use a crowdsourcing site that agrees with your philosophy. For example, I use Yelp. For me, that tends to be reviews that are left by local people rather than by tourists. And when I look at the Yelp top 10, I see a lot of restaurants that I like to frequent. So I trust the results I get from Yelp a little bit better. The other thing that I wanted to point out about Yelp is it's not as active in a lot of parts of Europe. You might find it in some big European cities, but it's not as universally well represented in all of Europe. However, different countries have their own kind of crowdsourcing review sites, and if you do a little research, you might find that, for example, there's a French version of Yelp that does a really good job with French restaurants, so there's an Italian version of Yelp. Other places that I look for good restaurant recommendations when I'm trying to find restaurants, for example, to add to my guidebook. A lot of newspapers have really good food and travel writing. I think the New York Times has really excellent food writing. They have a wonderful series called 36 Hours in a City, where they give you kind of a rundown of different kind of restaurants and bars and cafes and activities that you might do if you were there for a weekend. I really enjoy that. The Guardian, which is a London-based newspaper, has really excellent food writing as well and travel writing. If I'm going to a city and I want to find some new restaurants for my guidebook, I'll actually check these sources myself. The other thing I would recommend is looking for local food blogs. It's one thing to have an international journalist come and check things out, but it's another thing for somebody who really cares about food in their own community to tell you about that food. So I would just search the name of the place you're going and food blog. So you might search Rome food blog, and you might come up with Katie Parla's food blog. She's an American expat who lives in Rome and does really excellent food writing in Rome and has some great recommendations. I also have a lot of information on my blog, by the way. If you want to go to ricksteves.com and look for Cameron blog, you just search for that. A lot of the topics I'm talking about today are covered in my blog as well. Another great place to find restaurant recommendations is to ask your friends. Of course, these days, every time someone goes to a meal, they're going to take a picture on their phone. They're going to post it to Instagram or Facebook. And I'm kind of joking, but actually this is a good tip. You could send out you could make a post on Facebook saying, hey, I'm going to Barcelona. Has anyone been there? Do you have any tips for good restaurants? And you'll be surprised how many people are going to come back with their personal favorites. If you want to go a little more high-end, restaurant hunting can become very fun and very interesting, and you can look at really top-end resources. For example, the classic Michelin system, a restaurant that is Michelin starred, is almost guaranteed to be a very high quality. The San Pellegrino World's 50 Best Restaurants list is another resource that I've really enjoyed over the years. Finding out kind of not just which restaurants are really good, but what is the cutting edge of cuisine these days in Europe. A lot of these famous chefs that I mentioned earlier really made their name with these sorts of lists. And there's a lot of great food TV out there now as well. Netflix has an outstanding documentary series called The Chef's Table, and each episode is a profile of another chef all around the world, and I've found some really interesting chefs that way. Speaking of these high-end restaurant meals, I want to talk a little bit about this idea. Obviously, it's very expensive to go to a Michelin-rated restaurant. And for years, I kind of debated, is it worth it, even as a foodie, someone who cares about food, to spend that kind of money on a meal? I've actually made a point to try a couple of these over the last few years. And I have to say, what you have to realize when you're going to a really top-end, world-rated restaurant, it's not just about the food, although the food is amazing. They try to create a whole experience for you. So I went to a great restaurant in the Basque Country in northern Spain called Azurmendi. I think at the time it was the 13th top-rated restaurant in the world. And I thought, is this going to be worth basically the $200 a person that we were going to spend for a really nice lunch here? That sounds a little bit crazy, but we walked in the door, and the first course of amuse-bouche was this beautiful little picnic basket in their atrium, which had a lot of beautiful plants. And then they took us into their greenhouse, and we had another amuse-bouche, and we saw some of the plants that they actually used to get herbs for their cooking. And then they walked us into the kitchen, and we got to see the chef at work and all of his sous chefs scurrying around and making these dishes happen. We sat down at our table, and we chose which menu we wanted. And I have to say, the food was really remarkable, and it gave me a whole new appreciation for some of the trends and some of the really current thinking in terms of cooking and food in Europe. So I would say, obviously, if you're on a tight budget, you might not want to invest that much in a meal. But if you think about it, $200 a person, that's the cost of maybe a really fun day tour, for example, in a lot of cities. You hire a guide for the day for $200. $200 for a meal, for a very memorable meal, maybe is worth it for some people.